Good afternoon, Lady Cosgrove. How are you?
Good afternoon, Yoni, and Hazel is just fine, thank you. We're well, and you well too. And we wish you and Dina warmest mazel tov on the birth of little Herschel. We're delighted to hear your good news, and it's wonderful to have happy news at this time.
Absolutely.
And we nachas from him.
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be able to find this time to have a chat. Ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is Lady Hazel Cosgrove CBE, who is one of our fantastic members of St. John's Wood Synagogue, very involved in the community. Her husband, John, was one of our honorary officers and pillars of St. John's Wood community. So we're really proud and delighted that you to have a chat. First of all, tell me, how's life going during the pandemic? How are you guys managing? I know you've been at home an awful lot. How's everything going?
We're coping well, thank God. Everything's okay. We've got everything we need and things are fine. Just going on quite a long time. But
now, I know you actually grew up in Glasgow and you lived most of your married life in Edinburgh, and you only moved to St. John's Wood about 12 years ago or so. But I'm sure people would be interested to know a little bit about your background, but specifically about a rather personal story you have connected with the pandemic itself. So if I could ask you to share with us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Well, John and I both grew up in Glasgow, and our parents, my grandparents had come from Russia, but my grandfather actually died in the flu pandemic in 1919. That was a horrendous pandemic, worldwide too at that time, and it killed 230,000 people in the United Kingdom. And it was mainly young people at that stage. My grandfather was a man of only 45, and he caught the virus and was dead within 2 days, leaving my grandmother a widow with 9 children and no source of income. So my father was 8 years old at the time, and you can imagine that that event cast a shadow over his whole childhood, obviously put an end to any thought he had of further education or anything like that. So the thought of that pandemic has been very much part of my family's history. And I've been thinking recently about just how surprising, how amazing it is that 100 years later, with all our sophistication and all our confidence in our medical and scientific advances, that here we are again, struggling against a virus, a silent enemy that's proving to be so intractable. It just shows how unpredictable our lives are, I think.
Absolutely, that's an incredibly difficult story, and a powerful episode in your family history. But you know, you say those numbers, 230,000 people. Our population of the United Kingdom at that time was, of course, much lower.
Yes,
that is really a shocking statistic. But as you say, whether it was 1919 or 2019, for me personally, and I think for a lot of the people I've been interviewing and talking to, it's a reminder to, in a certain sense, how the Almighty runs the world and how we have so little control where we think we do have control.
It's a very powerful lesson to us, and it makes us feel very humble, I think, and it's really powerful.
How did your grandmother survive with 9 mouths to feed and such a situation? What happened?
She was a very resourceful woman, and she was a wonderful baker, and she opened a shop starting selling her own baked goods. And the children obviously had to go out to work as soon as they possibly could. My father was doing a milk round in the Gorbals in Glasgow when he was 10 years old, and often didn't have shoes to wear. So that was the kind of poverty they were living in, which is quite horrendous when you think about it.
Wow. And when did your grandmother pass away?
She died just after we were married, and she died in 1968. She was 96. Wow. So she was very, very strong woman.
And do you remember asking her about that period, you know, to lose a husband with otherwise in good health with 2 days notice? I mean, what was her recollections of that period?
I did. She didn't talk about it. So I didn't, and I didn't ask her. I was young in those days, and one didn't think about asking one's grandparents. Now I really regret that I didn't ask my grandparents more about that and about their earlier life in Russia before they came to Scotland.
It's an interesting thing, you know, family history is so important. Each and every one of us have a very special, unique history from our own family background and our own roots. And the idea of roots in Judaism is so important, to try and connect with your roots, with your parents, with your grandparents, and having that chain of the transmission of Jewish identity through all the chagim, all the festivals, all the customs on Seder night. It's so important.
Well, I think it's very important. That's actually what I've been doing during these weeks of lockdown. I've actually been writing a bit of my family history for the benefit of my children and grandchildren, because I think, as you say, it's very important to know where the roots from which you've sprung lie.
Sure,
And
sure.
yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, wrote a book in the 1950s about his family history. And we're so blessed that we have a huge amount of our own family history going back to the late 19th century as a result of that book. And my own sister's been doing the same thing as you. She's written a family book of all the family history during the lockdown. So everyone should try and perhaps use this time, as difficult it is, and as awful it is to know people have not been well, and bereavements and terrible tragedy in the world at large. Try and find something to do in this time that can be meaningful and useful. And that's just one example of many. Tell me something else, Hazel. If I could ask you, you know, you describe how your father grew up barely having any shoes on his feet. And within half a century later, his daughter has the most illustrious career and becomes the most senior Scottish lawyer, the first female judge in Scotland. I'd love to hear a little bit of some highlights of your career, and please share with us.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that what you've just highlighted is a mark of the open and free and fair society that exists in this country, and that was possible. My father had no chance of education, but he did set up a very successful fur business with his brothers, and I had the chance to good schooling and university career. And when I graduated from university, I decided I wanted to have a career in the law, and decided I wanted to be an advocate, which is what we call barristers in Scotland. At that time, the professions, and particularly the law, were male-dominated and controlled. And in fact, there were only 2 women at the Scottish Bar, only 2 practicing at the Scottish Bar. And I was told that the bar wasn't the place for a woman, and not to think of it. But I'm quite determined, and I'd made up my mind, and that's what I wanted to do. And I decided to give it a go, and I did. It was an uphill struggle, because you probably know that barristers and advocates depend upon solicitors to instruct them with work. And all my fellow junior advocates, most of them, had fathers or brothers or uncles who could give them work. But I was the first person in my family to go to university, so I didn't have that kind of advantage. But I persevered and worked at it, and built up a practice, quite a modest practice, and mainly doing family law work and personal injuries. And then I got what we used to call a tap on the shoulder from the Lord Advocate in Scotland. He was the government minister responsible for appointing judges. And after I had been in practice for about 12 years, he invited me to be a sheriff. And a sheriff in Scotland is a middle-ranking judge, about the same level as a circuit judge, with civil and criminal jurisdiction. And I, of course, agreed to do that. And I found that I loved being a judge. I really enjoyed it very much. Did that for about 12 years. And then because of the volume of work in the High Court at that time, it was decided to invite a few senior sheriffs to become part-time High Court judges. And there were a handful of us chosen to do that at the time, and I was one of them. And I did that for 3 years. And then there was a vacancy on the High Court bench, and I was invited to fill that and to become what in Scotland a High Court judge is called a senator of the College of Justice in Scotland. And I was the first woman in the 450 years of the court's history to hold that position. So the press had a field day. They said that the glass ceiling had been well and truly smashed, and the bastion of the Court of Session had been stormed, and all sorts of things like that. So it was all quite exciting. But it was, I certainly broke the mold, because judges until then had all been male and rather elderly. And I was, of course, female and only 50 years old at the time. So I certainly was in a different role from the others. But it was exciting and yes, and quite a challenge.
What a story. That's incredible. So you're the Rosa Parks of the legal world. You've really kind of taken everyone by storm, and you got to this senior position.
I was in the High Court for about 7 years, and I was promoted to the Appeal Court. So my career didn't actually finish there. Wow. I went on to be in the inner house of the Court of Session to be an Appeal Court judge. And that's where I ended my career. Yeah.
What an illustrious career. Looking back on that career, was there any case that was very exciting for you, that, you know, a highlight of your career, or an amazing moment when you were in court? Have you got anything funny to tell us, a story or some anecdote or experience or highlight over your many decades of service?
There weren't many other Jewish advocates or solicitors or lawyers around in Scotland at that time. And one day, one young Jewish advocate who was came into my court, and he was asking for an adjournment of the case at the very last moment. It really was the last moment. It was going to cause a lot of inconvenience to jurors and others. And he stood up and he said, I share with your ladyship the strong Protestant work ethic. And the whole court burst into laughter. And that was a very funny moment. It was very difficult for me to keep a straight face on that occasion, because he and I were the only two Jews around, but he shared with me the strong Protestant work ethic.
It's an interesting thing, you know, justice is a real Jewish quality as well. This whole idea, tzedek, tzedek, tirdov, we really strive for justice.
Absolutely.
We believe that God is the ultimate judge, and there's true justice and fairness in the world, although often we can't see it and often it doesn't make sense to us. But how much did your Jewish background and identity influence your judgments?
Well, I think that our whole Torah is a code of conduct for the construction of a society based on righteousness and justice. As you say, justice, justice shall you pursue. With the idea of equality before the law, the fundamental principle of fair trials and equality, are all there in the Torah long before any European convention or other convention on human rights. And I think if you're brought up with Torah learning, that you have these principles, and a career in the law is perhaps a natural follow-up to that.
Amazing. You know, it's amazing that you were honoured. You received your title CBE. I think you received it in Buckingham Palace. Tell us a little bit, how did that come to happen? Well,
it's for services to the criminal justice system in Scotland. I had, during my career, several what I would call extracurricular interests. I started off as a member of the Parole Board for Scotland, and then I was appointed chairman of the Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. This was while I was doing my judicial duties. And the Mental Welfare Commission is the body that looks after the interests of all those with mental illness or any kind of mental disability. And it was a very challenging time, because it was a time when the government were implementing their care in the community programme, and the psychiatric hospitals were all being closed, and the Commission had to hold the government to account for the kind of standard of care and supervision that people who were being released from mental hospitals into the community were receiving. So I chaired that for 6 years. And then I was invited to chair an expert panel on sex offending. That was at a time when sex offenders, convicted sex offenders, were in large numbers, both in the community and in prison. And the government wanted advice about programs for them and how to manage them. And I chaired that. And then lastly, after I had finished with mental health and sex offenders, I went on to boundaries, just at the time that the Scottish Parliament was set up. It was decided that because Scotland had its own parliament, the number of Westminster MPs in Scotland should be reduced quite substantially from 72 to 59. So that meant a substantial revision of all the constituency boundaries in Scotland. And I was tasked with chairing the committee that did that. So I had prisoners, mental health, sex offenders and boundaries. And it was for that I got my CBE, for services to criminal justice in Scotland.
And how well deserved. You know, I find it very inspirational, you know, to see somebody who Jewish mother and wife running a beautiful Jewish home with a very successful career, with not only focusing on your career, but also focusing on extracurricular interests. And I know even now in your retirement, you're so busy with many Jewish causes. You're the chair of the United Kingdom Lawyers for Israel. You are also involved in Stands With Us. You're on the board of Stands With Us. It's just inspirational. First of all, tell us a little bit about your involvement in those organizations, and where did this passion and energy come from to want to do so much for so many different things? Well,
thank you. Well, I've been brought up in a very strongly Zionistic home, and I'm a passionate Zionist. I've got a daughter, blessed to have a daughter and son-in-law and 4 grandchildren living in Israel, and we have a home in Israel. And Israel is a cause that's very dear to my heart, and it pains me when I hear Israel being denigrated and unfairly criticized. So both of these organizations, Stand With Us is focused on helping students to understand the situation in Israel and to present it when they meet with criticism in a university setting, so that they can stand up for Israel and answer back. And the United Kingdom Lawyers for Israel uses the law to fight Israel's cause and anti-Semitism as well. So these are obviously causes dear to my heart.
That's fantastic to hear about all these amazing things that you're involved with. And I can see that, please God, it continues through the generations. You've got children living in Israel, and even your children and grandchildren here also make you very proud. I have the privilege of teaching your grandson James in JFS.
Yes, he enjoyed it very much.
Please send him my best. Hello, James, if you're watching this. So really, just to conclude, I thought, first of all, thank you for this amazing history of what you do and what you've done and what you continue to do. Just to spice up my interviews a little bit, I've asked everyone to share with me now something interesting in your home, perhaps something that's connected to your past or your Jewish identity. Share with us something, Hazel.
Okay, I spoke about my grandmother who was left with 9 children. These here are her candlesticks. I use them every Friday night to light my candles. And these came with her on the boat from Russia, in Zaga in Russia, to Dundee, where she landed with her father in about 1900. Wow. And these have been with me ever since I got married, and they're very precious to me.
They're absolutely beautiful, and look after them. And I'm sure
Russian silver. Yeah.
You should please God be blessed to light them for many, many more years on a Friday night in good health.
Thank you.
Please send my best to John, and thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
It's been my pleasure, Yoni. Thank you.
All the best.
All the best.